Welcome all. My name is John Uriarte, Digital Programs Curator at the Photographers Gallery. Thank you all for joining us for this second screen walk today with Irish artist Alan Butler. I know that there's still people coming in, but we will start with these introductions. Screen walks is a series of online streams featuring artists performing guided explorations of specific online and digital spaces in which their core artistic research and practice takes place. This will be our second event after the first screen walk led by Penelope Imbrico 2 weeks ago. Screen Walks was born from the commitment of the Museum Winter Tour in Switzerland and the Photographers Gallery in London to support artists and researchers in their ongoing experimentation and development on topics related to post-photography and network image culture. The Screen Walks have a hybrid format between a workshop, a guided tour, and a behind-the-scenes live documentary. Every event will be different and will feature an artist or a collective working on a specific online and digital environment. Online marketplaces, as with Penelope Imbrico, virtual worlds, dating platforms, or video games as today. In terms of technicalities, this stream will last around an hour. And this time we will have a special bonus feature. Because once the screen walk is over, Alan will debut as a specific online performer. You are all invited to join him on skillwalks.com once the screen walk is over. For those of you in Zoom, your microphones should be muted already. If not, please go ahead and mute them now. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so you can write messages in the public chat on Zoom or send them privately to Mark and me if you have questions for the Q&A or throughout the stream. The video is being recorded and will be archived, so please do not activate your camera if you don't want to be recorded. However, on our last screen walk with Penelope Imbrico, she mentioned that she really appreciated the sound of the participants left their cameras on, so because she was able to see their faces, so who was she talking to. So if you want to leave it on, it's also welcome. Marco?
And hello, everyone, from my side, too. My name is Marco De Mutis. I'm the digital curator for the Museum Winter Tour in Switzerland. Once again, it's fantastic to see so many of you here today. When John and I conceived Screen Walks, we both thought immediately about exploring computer games as one of the digital spaces which are being explored for artistic research and production. So games have become, now since a long time, a bigger industry than cinema or music. And with the current restrictions on mobility enforced by international lockdowns, social distancing is keeping people indoors and playing games more than ever. Steam, one of the most popular gaming marketplaces, has seen a new record of more than 22 million players logging on the site over the weekend of the 21st and 22nd of March. So this makes video games some of the spaces that are inhabited by a huge part of the population in our daily screen lives. On top of that, game spaces have become increasingly exciting places for artists to explore in the last decades. So this is not something new, but something that we've seen since even the late 90s with movements like machinima, modding, game art, performances and intervention throughout gameplay, and the phenomenon of in-game photography. And this one is particularly interesting for us here today and for photography professionals and institutions in general. In-game photography is usually referred, for those who are new to this term, as the practice of saving images from game environments, either through photographs of the screens, screenshots, or simulated camera functions within the game. These are called photo modes. Two things are particularly interesting for us from the point of view of the image and photography. First, over the last 20 years, the game industry has pushed the notion of photorealism in computer graphics, increasingly striving to achieve a technology that can simulate a photographic and cinematic representation of the world. So what does this mean in terms of representation when we are confronted with photorealistic CGI and simulations as a mediation of the world? And the second thing is the role of the photographer and the artist in such spaces. So how does the player photographer work in relation to the game? Is she still playing the game? Is she playing against it, with it? Or is she playing a different game altogether? And finally, what can the game, seen through the eyes of such artists, tell us about our society at large? So tonight to talk about this and much more is Alan Butler, who has been making works with and around computer games extensively, but who has also combined this platform with a strong conceptual approach, connecting and extending the game screen worlds to the physical world and its social, political, and economic implications. Through his works, he reminds us that simulation is a two-way street, a feedback loop that is affected by the world it portrays, but it also has consequences on the very same world. His practice also extends and connects the role of the image, ranging widely among techniques and processes that start with texture file and might end in cyanotypes, and employ techniques that connect screenshotting and wet plate collodion processes. I'm going to stop here and let Alan take us for a wild ride on his screen. And once again, I'd like to remind you that after our screen walk, we'll end our Zoom stream. So the Zoom meeting will be terminated and we'll all check on screen walks for Alan's debuting his live stream performance. So make sure to go there after the Zoom event and check that out. Fall asleep with it or have breakfast or lunch with it, depending where you are. Alan, thanks so much for accepting this invitation, and the screen is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Marco and John, for inviting me to do this, and everyone at the Photo Museum Vintage Tour and the Photographers Gallery. And I guess also for everyone who's actually in the Zoom meeting or watching this on Twitch as well, because you know, like it's nice to see that like there is such an interest in this field. Like it does feel like a very kind of niche speciality a lot of the times. It can be a very difficult area, even like when I have the opportunity to do a talk somewhere, it can be quite difficult to, I don't know, like explain the mechanics of what in-game photography is. And I guess what I'm going to try and do here is I'm going to actually bring everybody into at least one game, maybe a couple of games, and I'm going to try and look at a few different things as we go along. Now, because of that, what I would say is that I don't necessarily have like a very kind of strict order on how this is going to go, because video games nowadays are very non-linear and different things can happen as I go along. So there is a number of things, I guess, I will begin to look at over the next hour, and I'm not sure how many of those I'll get through, but I'll try and get through as many as possible. So one of them I'm going to look at is my approaches to producing in-game photography. I'm going to look at some strategies for moving around in digital worlds, in this case, video games. And again, like what's different about this talk is that like I'm going to be like inside the game world, and I'm going to be coming back out of it. I'm going to be going into websites. I'm going to be going back into the video game, and then I'm actually going to go into kind of pull up the engine hood of the game and have a route around in all the files that make it work as well. I might talk at the beginning as well about like how I arrived in this field. But I guess for me, what my background is in fine art. I didn't really overlap with the photography world at all until I started producing in-game photography. But that's also weirdly led me to interact with a lot of different disciplines over the last few years. So some of the projects that I might kind of begin to show this evening include, you know, virtual street photography, photo book replication, cyanotype processes, moving image works, sculpture and installations, and maybe some glass plate collodion photographs as well. So maybe to kick things off, we'll just jump into a video game. which kind of started off a lot of my interests in in-game photography, and it wasn't as an artist. I was thinking, oh great, I'll buy this game and I'll become an artist in it. I came to this, I suppose, from the point of view of a gamer. We can just jump into the map now. So this game, Grand Theft Auto 5, is probably, you know, the game that really kind of maybe mainstreamed a lot of in-game photography. And the type of game it is called an open world game. And this basically means that you inside the game, you know, you don't have to stick to the violence driven narrative. You can put down all of the weapons, and you can actually take out a camera, which every player has, which I'll show you in a minute. Now, Marco did refer previously to the idea that originally in-game photography started with a process of screenshotting. So everybody knows about, you know, taking a screen grab of something and saving it. Now, the way that would have worked is basically, you know, the player would have been stuck on a point of view in the game, and they would have, you know, found a nice image that they wanted to take a photograph of, and they would take a screen capture of this and save that. And that was maybe the very early types of in-game photography. And but what was different about this particular game is that in any of these open world simulations, you know, there's loads of different areas that kind of just act as realities where the player can just walk around. And it was actually after about 2 years of playing this game, I was driving under this bridge. It's in a area of the game called Strawberry, and basically it's just a part of kind of a simulation of downtown LA. And under this bridge, as I drove by, I noticed this thing which was quite spooky the first time I encountered it. There's a kind of village of homeless people that live in this particular area of the video game. Now, what was weird about this was that the homeless people actually don't feature in the video game at all. Well, as far as, you know, any of the kind of game narratives and storyline is concerned. At the moment, it's morning time, so like we're not going to see many people around. But what we're seeing at the moment is the kind of places where these virtual homeless people live inside the video game. Now, just to clarify that, like the virtual homeless people are not, you know, human players. They're usually what's usually called a NPC, which is a non-playable character, or a non-player character. What this means is, you know, as you go around your business in a video game, like there's drivers in those cars, and they're called non-player characters. Non-player characters could also, I suppose, be, you know, like that mailbox there, or the garbage can behind it. But here's a couple of non-player characters that are just standing by some bins here. Now, when I encountered these first, you know, like, oh, okay, so they're going to start shouting at me if I don't go away. I'll just hide away from them down this laneway. So these non-player characters, like you would have the option to interact with them, like with your weapons or your fists in the video game. But when I encountered them first, I actually took out a cell phone, as you'll see in this kind of behind my head here. And I went down and I selected an app in the virtual camera called Snapmatic. And basically it's a virtual camera in the game. So every player has one of these. So, you know, you can zoom in and out, move up and down, and then also you can, you know, turn on depth of field, turn off depth of field. You can even turn around and do a selfie mode if you want. But it was at this point that I guess like I stopped playing the video game and started to kind of look at, you know, these digital humans here and kind of figure out like, well, what are they, you know, and where do they live and why are they there? And because for a game like Grand Theft Auto, which is very much a simulation of our world, in particular, it's a simulation of Los Angeles and the surrounding rural areas in California. And like what's interesting is that, you know, like if the producers of this game are in the business of producing kind of sufficiently real simulations, this particular game is from 2013, which is like a generation or two in video game terms ago. But if they're in the business of producing a sufficiently real simulation, there's this kind of weird thing that even though there's a lot of stuff that doesn't feature in the game storyline, it's there to kind of fill out an ambient reality. And one of those things are populations of homeless people in the game. And I began to find this quite interesting in terms of, you know, these non-playable characters, because ontologically speaking, like they're, let's just go into the camera for a second. So ontologically speaking, in terms of the game mechanics, there's no difference between this kind of set of weeds here and this homeless person. However, when, you know, using like a photographic trope like street photography, and you can take a photograph and look at it behind my head there, that can be uploaded to a website if you want. I'm saving it to the photo gallery for the moment. But so what I began to do is basically walk around the video game and just using the in-game camera photograph all of the instances of homeless people. I was looking at their surroundings. I was looking at their conversations. I was looking at the places on the maps as well where they were congregating the most. So, you know, there's certain areas of this map which are like, you know, Hollywood Hills and it's full of mansions. You're not going to find homeless people there. In fact, like they're in specific places relating to where homeless people would congregate in Los Angeles. So in downtown LA, there's this kind of area called Skid Row. But there's also a few other kind of places on the map as well. Even way up in the rural territory here, we might take a drive there later, but there's what you call them, a commune of homeless by choice, anti-capitalist non-player characters in the game. So I wasn't really thinking about this being an art project at the beginning, but then like eventually I had about 1,500 photographs, and I was collecting them in a folder, and I just started going through them, and I was kind of thinking, wow, these are kind of interesting. But I guess like for me, like it's not necessarily the image that's the most interesting part. I'm very interested in, you know, the kind of structural elements of it. I'm interested in the materiality of the image that I'll take a look at when we take the image out of the software itself. And I'm interested in how these images then perform in the world. So, you know, if a photographer has a set of photographs, they're able to think about, well, what am I going to do with these photographs? You know, do I print them? Do I put them on a wall? Do I, you know, make a photo book, but put them on magazines or billboards and that kind of stuff. So what the first thing I actually decided to do, I'm going to jump out into a web browser. The first thing I did was I produced a website. Now I gave the project a title, which is Down and Out in Los Santos. And the tagline was documenting homelessness and poverty in the city of Los Santos and Blaine County. So without specifically referring to this being a video game, I wanted the reference to be there at the front. But what I was interested in doing with these was seeing how these images would perform in reality. Now, a website is one way of doing that, but like nobody looks at websites anymore. You know, like everything's on social media. So that made me break one of my cardinal rules, which is join a Facebook social network, and I joined Instagram, and I started putting these photographs up one a day. I can't remember, it was maybe around 2016 I started doing this. The whole set is up there at the moment. There's almost 2,000 posts, which, you know, really forensically go through, you know, every area of this video game where there might be symptoms of poverty or homelessness. You know, just click through some of these, just get a better look at those. So what was interesting here in terms of how they were performing in the, I guess out in the wild as photographs, was I wanted to see how they would blend in on a photo sharing website like Instagram. And like I did this in a really primitive way, which was by using hashtags. So especially like the ones at the very beginning, I'm not going to be able to scroll all the way down, but a lot of the hashtags I use at the beginning were things like, you know, hashtag street photography, hashtag digital photography, hashtag like documentary photo. And I wanted to see could these things blend in. And before they even did that, there was like really interesting things happening where I was using, let's say, hashtag digital art. And I didn't have any followers on the account at the beginning, but like every time I posted something, I would get like 50 or 60 likes. And I was kind of thinking like, who on earth is looking at these things? And I discovered on Instagram, people install these bots on their accounts called, I don't know what they are, but they're bots to like other people's posts. They're kind of like sycophant bots, because the idea is that they'll look at a particular hashtag, like hashtag street photography, and then press like on it in the hope that the person's photograph, they'll see that and say, oh, that person liked my photograph, I'll follow them, or I'll like some of their photographs back. And I thought what was really interesting in that was that the first audience for this, I guess, before I had any human followers, was actually software. You know, so there was like this, these scripts that were accessing the image through its metadata and interacting with it before there was any human audience. And it was by using, like, and it's kind of really cynical in a way that I kind of went in to do that, but by using those things, it began to then open up like these other audiences. And it was like the images were definitely featured in, you know, street photography, roundups on Instagram. They recommend, I think, like, so one of the like Getty reportage photo or something, like posted some of them on their website. But yeah, like, so like I was kind of liking the idea of them blending in and beginning to kind of interact with so-called real photography. But I guess the more I began thinking about in-game photography, the less I started feeling that it was any different from photography that we know, you know, in terms of like holding a camera and pointing at an object and pressing click. Like the more you get into the mechanics, the kind of more similar that in-game photography becomes to the real thing as well. I'm going to jump back into Grand Theft Auto for a brief second.
In fact, there's a question, Alan, that might be interesting to bring up. There's Charles wondering about representation. Was asking if there was concern about the homeless people and this as a representation of life. And what is the ethical decision made in cartooning these images? If we are to consider that photographs are only representations.
Yeah, well, that was something that did come up a couple of times in terms of people who were interacting with the photographs on Instagram that thought that they were looking at real homeless people. And they were not necessarily angry with the photographer exploiting their image, but more kind of offering kind of like sympathy towards the subject in the photograph. There have been a couple of really interesting conversations about it in terms of like some people were talking about how it's almost like this non-exploitative version of doing street photography. Like there's always this ethical question of like, oh, is it okay for like a photographer just to go around and, you know, capture these moments of people's lives most of the time without their permission, and, you know, profit from that in various ways, you know, like this kind of mythological photographer that might do that.
I was wondering, sorry, if I can just jump in, because I think it's a very interesting question, this idea of ethics, but through the mediation of the CGI and the simulation of the developers, isn't the ethical question kind of bounced back to the developer in a way? So in this sense, your act of photographing is not photographing the homeless people through the camera, you're photographing the process of simulating them from the side of the developer in a way, no?
Yeah. Well, I'll go into this a bit more when I start looking at like in the files that make up the game, because yeah, like I think it'll become clear what it is we're looking at when we actually see, when we pull apart all the files and have a look at them. But you know, it's definitely interesting. Somebody has definitely made a decision to depict. Let's go back into the browser. Let's say somebody's definitely taken a decision to depict a homeless person in a certain way, wearing certain clothes with a particular color skin. You know, they say particular things, they act in particular ways in the game. Like more often than not in the game, like if you stand beside them and just listen to the non-playable characters, like the homeless people in the game just act kind of crazy. But like at one level you can kind of say, well, this is really kind of shallow representation in on the developer's part. But like on the other side, it's like there is a big limit to kind of the detail that can go into one of these simulations without completely like crashing everybody's computer. You know, there's a lot less people on the streets and cars on the streets than in real life. Like actually video games in terms of like the amount of people on the streets look a lot more like the lockdown outside that's happening right now, you know, like that we're kind of more in that kind of weirdo simulation kind of stage. And that has a lot to do with just the fact that like computers aren't fast enough to have enough detail on the in the database on the players. So they have to like reduce all of the players both at every ends of, you know, spectrum of privilege to these kind of like poster style versions of what that type of person might be. But we can have a look in terms of the imagery in a few moments when we go in, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So back in Grand Theft Auto. So yeah, like going around and taking photographs in this game. Like one of the really interesting things that I wanted to engage with was just the limits that you have in a virtual body. You know, like I'm now in a point of view from the player here. I can look down at my shadow, and I can look around me here and press another button, and I can see 360 around my player. But if I take out my camera, I'm kind of very limited in terms of the places I can go. Like in this particular game, you can't keep walking when you go into the camera mode. You can just zoom. And while your image is saving, you can walk around a bit again. But you can only do a few different things within that. And for me, that actually presented a really interesting proposition, which is that if I was going to kind of role play as a photographer, like a street photographer in this virtual video game, that I wouldn't do the screenshotting thing in a kind of non-human point of view. It was more that I liked the restrictions that this piece of software gives its user to explore the world through that lens. So, you know, like there's other video games like Watch Dogs and things like games where you might have like a drone and you're able to fly around on a drone and take photographs and things like that. But what I really liked about this was that like the restrictions of the game itself really lent itself well to the kind of realism of how you would use your body if you were a street photographer out in the real world. And it's interesting in terms of, for me, I think, thinking about that proximity to the screen, you know, where does the image take place? Like Marco asked, you know, like, are we photographing, you know, the developers' interpretations of what a homeless person is? But just kind of, there's these other levels to these ideas, actually, I think, in terms of like how we understand images. There's we'll just jump back into a browser for a second. So there's a couple of photographers. Let's have Michael Wolfe. I think that's the right one. Oh, it is, yeah. Okay, so there's Michael Wolfe photography, and then let's say John Rathman. Nice. So both of these projects, I'm sure loads of you have seen these before. So both of these projects are done by appropriating interesting scenes in Google Street View. So the Google's software where you kind of go through 3D, through streets, through images that are stitched together. And both of them have these very similar projects, but they're kind of completely different in different ways. Like this, both of these are in a way very like the process of screenshotting, and in different levels as well. So if we look at, let's say, John Rathman's ones, you'll see you have the Google Street View navigation controls are there. And it seems that like size-wise, all of these are formally the exact same. So what he's been doing is like, you know, going around and around and screenshotting all of these interesting scenes that have come out of Google Street View. And Michael Wolfe's A Series of Unfortunate Events does something very similar, because it's going around Google Street View and showing us all of these kind of extraordinary scenes that those cars capture. But what's interesting in the terms of the differences where the capture is taking place, like on Michael Wolfe's here, you don't see any of the navigation controls. You see like the pixel lines, and you actually see the mouse as well. So what he's doing is taking a photograph of the screen with an actual camera. And John Raffman's is a screenshot, so that's happening inside like the operating system software, and that might seem kind of very kind of superficial kind of difference in terms of two things get an effect, but they kind of say two different completely and explore two different worlds. And like the John Raffman one, like his practice is very much about like this kind of crazy miasma of online culture and like visual cultures that have kind of emerged out of various types of technologies. And Michael Wolfe, like this particular project, I think won of some World Photojournalism Award in, I think it was like the year 2012. And if you could think about what was happening in the world at that time, it was the Arab Spring was happening. There was like the rise of the citizen journalist, these kind of ideas. And so having a documentary photographer photographing the screen puts his like body in a different proximity to the screen than the kind of archival interests of what Raffman was doing in the Nine Eyes project. And again, like this is why I was kind of interested in thinking about Grand Theft Auto and these restrictions, is that it's not really a process of screenshotting per se, because there is a kind of like the screenshotting that's happening, let's say on something like Google Street View would be very static imagery, but these are three-dimensional spaces. There's parallax, we can walk around things, we can zoom in on things, we can change the depth of field. We can, like, there's loads of filters in the camera and borders and things like that, which I never use. I always just tried to put up the images as they came out of the camera.
Actually, Alan, sorry to interrupt you, but maybe this is a good time also to bring up a couple of questions that connect to what you just said.
Yeah.
So Lee is asking if you think that newer games are attempting to cater for this function. And he's mentioning like the new Metro Exodus game and camera function and the controls that you have over the camera settings. Seems like an invitation for artists to explore this art form. And the second question from Santiago, he was wondering about your scouting process. Like if you were looking for to happen, and are you walking around the space? Maybe more about like how you walk around the game or your process.
Yeah, well, it depends on the project. So in this particular game, I went around in a car and on foot, and I was really role playing like a street photographer inside the game. So it was like at the very beginning, I was just interested in kind of figuring out like what are ways to avoid violence-driven narratives. Then that like turned into, oh well, I could become a photographer, and then it became this kind of thing. Well, you should kind of go all the way and just become a complete nerd about it, and kind of restrict yourself to those parameters to produce the stuff. But I made some moving image works. There's a director mode where you can make films in this as well. I don't know if we'll have time to go much into that now. But within that, you're able to kind of fly around a bit more and kind of get different angles and check out the scenery. But the scouting process for this particular game was very much on foot and in cars and in helicopters as well. Like I remade a couple of films in Grand Theft Auto 5, and one of them had a lot of helicopter shots, and I was getting in virtual helicopters and attaching the camera to the helicopter through a mod and flying around the game to produce those things. So once I got up in the helicopter, it actually like opened up the whole kind of virtual world of this particular space in particular. But I could show you in terms of let's like do something fun, and we'll jump over to a PlayStation. So I'm in Red Dead Redemption 2 here, okay? And so like this has a similar, has an old kind of glass plate collodion camera thing where you can kind of look around and, you know, zoom in. But like, what's crazy is that like, you wouldn't have that kind of zoom or any zoom in the kind of, I think it's like in year 1900 this is set. And you know, you can take a photograph, but they also have this other way of producing photography now in the game, which is photo mode, which allows you then kind of like free yourself out of an orbit camera and actually just kind of move up and around. And you know, you can use these zoom lenses, you can you know, change the exposure, change the blur and the depth of field and stuff like that. But what these tools allow you to do in a way that walking around doesn't allow you to do is like they allow you to actually just kind of move up and down and in ways that actually don't kind of make sense as a human photographer. So you're able to like look at the spaces and kind of figure out what you want to photograph in a very different sense. Now, maybe to have a quick look, I'm just kind of conscious about time at the moment. So one of the things in terms of scouting for like subject matter, I'd basically given myself a narrow subject to look at, and that kind of produce this series of photographs, which would then perform in various places. They ended up in galleries and magazines and internet sites and all this kind of stuff. But one of the other projects that when I began to see how what have I done? When I began to see how these worlds are actually put together, I remade a film called Koyaanisqatsi, shot for shot, in Grand Theft Auto 5 over the course of about a year and a half. And from that, like in order to, you know, reproduce a whole feature film, like you can't just do it in the game. So like I went into like the mod communities, which are people who modify video games to kind of give customizable features and things like that. And there's all of these ways they do that, but one of them is, you know, like there's these little applications that allow you get into the kind of the files that make up the video game. So this is one that I'm looking at here. I'm going to switch to desktop. This is one I'm looking at here. And this one is a particular like mod pack for Grand Theft Auto 5. So we could look in, let's see what we get out of this. Homeless. I'm just Googling some files here. I don't think that's what we want. This is a car wreck. So it allows you kind of, you know, go in and find all the different files that are in the video game code itself. Let's have another search. I think some of the files are called vagrants. Nope, that's a car. Vehicles. Tools. This is something I could have figured out before this, right? So let's say, okay, so weeds. Okay, so here's some weeds from the video game. So these would have been the kind of things I would have been photographing. Not necessarily at the beginning because they're weeds, but because these ones had litter in them and therefore likely will appear in the video game in places where there is homeless people, in places where there's poverty within the game reality. So this is what a so-called 3D file on a video game in its database looks like when you take it out and just look at it as a model itself. And what that is you know, a 3D kind of wireframe skeleton, and what's mapped to that are a bunch of textures, and the textures look like this. So I wonder, can I export these? It's probably not gonna let me export them necessarily. Might look for another one. Export embedded textures. Stop. Okay, so it's giving me loads of textures here. So these are some of the weeds. And it comes with a couple of other files. This also looks like the weeds, as you can see, but this is what's called a normals map, which also gets applied to the 3D file to kind of give it some texture. And then there is another one, which I think is like a specular map, which tells the light in the video game of which parts to reflect off the game surface. And I guess like through like my scouting process of, you know, finding subject matter in the video game and kind of figuring out all of the kind of back end mechanics in terms of like we could take out some of these textures, like these are the textures for the weeds or the litter that's kind of in all of the weeds in the video game. Like there's a burger wrapper and cigarette packets and beer cans and burger wrappers and all that kind of stuff. So you could actually change those to say whatever you want, put them back in the video game, and they'd appear in the space. But it was the plants that like maybe like to move on quickly to another project. It's the plants that kind of began to interest me, just in terms of like how lovely they look when they're on a you know, on a 3D model, but like when they're by themselves, they're quite kind of almost clinical and depressing. And it was through that where I started playing around with a project where I was kind of thinking about the idea of the work of Anna Atkins. And so Anna Atkins was like the first female photographer. She was producing cyanotypes about 3 years after the advent of photography. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with these, you've seen them at some point in your life. And what they are is contact exposures of algae and plant life from the British Isles. So Atkins was a botanist, and in order to document as much of the kind of plant life in her studies as quick as possible, she used this 19th century photographic method called cyanotyping. And I was thinking about these just in a formal sense of the, you know, the mixture between like each image has a what do you call it? So my head's in the way again. So each image has, you know, or each piece would have a contact exposure to the sun with the photochemical process, and then a label underneath which describes what it is. And I was kind of thinking a lot about these in terms of virtual plants and the difference between real plants and fake plants. Like a virtual plant is one that never dies, but it's always maybe in some sort of state of like maybe the undead. More often than not, these are actually kind of somewhere in between like photographic specimens used and hand painted materials that are put into the video game. But they also have interesting titles, file names. So let's see. So that one we were just looking at was NXG_grass_4 is the name of that. So I got into this kind of idea. I ran some experiments before making a whole series, but how would I extract plant life from video game worlds and produce cyanotypes in the kind of photochemical 19th century process. So let me, Marco loves when he gets to see people's desktops and all their files. So here we go. So where do I have them? Do I have them? It's wallpapers, swimming pools. So textures. So here's some of the textures for I'm going to try and open that and see does my computer crash. And I'll show you some of the images I made. God damn it. So yeah, here's some images. So these are images from the early 90s of plants extracted in a similar process to what I was describing. And these ones are from the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. And you can see they're kind of much lower resolution, but these are just the plants extracted themselves. These are very like 8-bit images. And when I go into, so that's one just there. I'll try and enter the site to see a few more. I made a whole series of virtual botany cyanotypes. So I haven't updated my website in a couple of years on this, but here's some examples of some, I need to maybe move that, yeah. So here's some examples of some of the cyanotypes themselves. All of these specimens are extracted from video games and then put onto contact kind of transparency film, and then through the traditional 19th century photochemical process, they're exposed through real sunlight. So they're like virtual plants exposed through real sunlight to kind of produce this kind of weird kind of quasi-digital analog image. I think they really exist in both the analog and digital. I actually have some small ones beside me which I can show you, just to kind of get a better idea. So I don't know if that's focusing okay, but what you'll see a lot is let's say around the edges here, there's the jaggedy kind of digital lines, but then you'll also like see the fiber of the paper itself, and you know, even the lighter parts in the which way am I going here? The lighter parts in the image itself. There's almost like JPEG compression that exists within those as well. So like in terms of the images themselves, so this would have been taken from a whole plant sample from some video game, maybe one of the Elder Scroll games, and then you know, it's laid out in the file with the original file name at the bottom, and then produce on cyanotype process. There's another one, just to kind of give you an idea, bit more up close about what they actually look like. So the series that I've produced in these is it's almost complete, and at the moment, like I went through over 4 years, I went through about 26,000 video games going back to 1975, and just kind of went through and found like thousands and thousands and thousands of plant specimens. Now, you know, a lot of those games I went through, it turned out they didn't have plants. You know, they might be like poker games or snooker games or something like that, and you know, so they're very quickly discarded. But going in, you know, and you know, getting old arcades from the 70s and 80s, or home consoles from the 70s, the early 80s, game consoles when they really began to come in the 80s, all the way through the 90s, and like in the last 20 years as well. And the whole series really now kind of explores the evolution of resolution in video games, and like how that's evolved. So in terms of how that I feel, for me, it's similar in my practice to the street photography, is that what it's essentially doing is that, like, I'm less interested in producing photographs or pictures or images, but rather using those existing kind of modalities to explore our relationship to technology, or kind of our experience of like how we encounter simulation. And again, a lot of it's about kind of trying to, you know, find some sort of level of autonomy in corporate virtual reality spaces as well. I kind of see it as there's a definite kind of poetic, for me, definitely a poetic connection between like a video game world and, you know, living so much of our lives on Facebook and Twitter and things like that. So I'm just conscious of the time, John or Marco.
Yes, actually, Alan, we were just thinking that we have a few questions coming up in the chat, and maybe it would be a good time to maybe bring this to a Q&A, and maybe have people asking the question themselves if they want, so we can, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
So I have a few questions that people has been writing on the public chat. I don't know if any of you will be okay of like showing your face and sharing it with Alan, so he can know who he's talking to. For instance, I have a question by Felix that I could.
Turn on your camera if you want to ask that in person. Otherwise, turn it off and we'll read your question from the chat.
Yeah. One sec. Anyway, I think it's gonna be easier if we do the question directly. So Felix was asking just if through the game settings that you have like much control with over the entire world on Grand Theft Auto, including the sun, the surface textures, or the NPC population, and how does this compare to an artist's control over live street scenes? If there's a comparison between the control that you have in a game and on real life and taking photos.
I'm not sure if I followed all that.
So what's the difference between the control that you have over the Grand Theft Auto world, like the sun, the surface textures, and the NPCs, and the control that you have on the street life, on the physical life?
Well, like I guess like in terms of games like Grand Theft Auto, like there's like mod communities, you can change absolutely anything. You can walk around like Marge Simpson and everyone looks like Bart Simpson if you want. And like the textures of the pavement are no different. It could be made out of meat or whatever you want. In terms of just for my approach, I was more interested in kind of looking at how we can look at our own world by looking at like what's important for the developers to include in the kind of ambient reality. So all of this stuff that we're not necessarily asked to follow by like going around shooting people and all of these things around us. But I didn't manage to find any of the actual, hang on, let me try and just find some of these homeless people as well. Because I think it could be good to show some of the files. Because what they have more connection to in a way than the photography is actually painting. They're very like painterly produced images, and I think like if you're producing 3D kind of photographic simulations in 3D worlds, it has like this very strong connection to painting. So like your control over these worlds has a lot to do with kind of how much you want to engage it in like a level of code, a level of painting, and then a level of world building, and then what you do with that as in producing images. I'll keep looking for some of these homeless characters. But I'm not sure if that really answers that question, actually.
Well, in the meantime, maybe we can move on to the next question so that we can just keep things going. Yeah, as I said, if you want to ask the question yourself, turn on your camera because it's also easier for us to find you, I guess, in the first rows. We had one question coming in from, I'm trying to follow your chronological order. Julia, but I don't see her. So in the meantime, maybe I'll just read her question. Did you consider photographing more wealthy NPCs, and why did you decide not to include these in the project? I'm not sure if it makes sense as a critique, but I could imagine someone making an argument that this reproduces problems in street photography with making a spectacle out of vulnerability.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So to maybe answer why I did it the way I did, let me go into this website here. So this is the Rockstar Social Club. It's like a kind of bridge social networking website that exists in the video game, but also on our internet. And this is where you access the images that you produce in the video game. Now, what I'm looking at the moment is it's all selected on my content. So I only have one image, which I took yesterday as a test. But if we go into all content, let's have a look what we have here. So the way people use in-game photography in just the kind of everyday sense of just gamers taking snapshots of things, you'll see a couple of things here. Anyone who's kind of gone to art school has maybe done a semester on the male gaze. You'll be able to figure out what's going on in the gamer's mind by looking at their photographs here. But what these images so often do, and in as many games, even aside from this, is games are generally about violence and accumulating something, generally wealth. And because of that, the photographs people will take of themselves, who are just gamers, not like ironic bastard artists, you know, but like who are just gamers, like there will always just be a display of power and wealth within their virtual world. There's a lot of really good work done on artists out there who do look at this kind of thing about glorifying um, uh, kind of wealth and capitalism in video game worlds. But like this is a really genuine sense of self-expression within these video game worlds. But in terms of what I'm showing is the exact opposite of what this tool generally gets used for. Like you will see photographs of homeless people pop up every now and then, but what you're generally going to see is players objectifying women's bodies. They're going to show you their cool car. That's a cool car. And then they're going to show you maybe some guns they got, some new clothes that they bought in the game, and all of that kind of stuff. So like because of the main focus of the game, I suppose, is just about like capitalism. In a way, like the game is a kind of Marxist critique of capitalism because it has this kind of other side to the whole thing. Like rather than, you know, accumulating a couple of billions of dollars, you could decide you would earn a lot less money and become a taxi driver in the game, you know, but not many people have ever only done that, I suppose. So I guess that's why I was gravitating towards the homeless people. It was definitely like looking at poverty was definitely something that wasn't really ever looked at when you, like, if you go looking for people's images that get transferred onto Instagram, they're gonna look like this. But also it's like I think it's like important like to include like documentation of those sides of things that do get forgotten, because again, like if Rockstar are in the business of simulation and, you know, including like tragedy within that, you know, like the tragedy of people's lives, even in a kind of, you know, simulacra form, really is an indictment of reality itself, you know, like they're included because our world is unfair, because it's like we don't live in an equal society. So to create a sufficiently real simulation, they have to be included in that, and that's the kind of tragedy of the series, I suppose, and why I was interested in that. Whether or not it perpetuates things in the real world, again, like this is kind of a virtual version of reflecting what's happening out in the real world, I think.
We have another question from Jerome, who was asking when and why did you start your nature walks in the game? What was the starting point? Any reasons to start with that?
I think the nature walks kind of started in the file system. Like, let me just jump into desktop. So when I was going through the file system here, I think I found some, something's gone wrong. Okay. So when I was going through some of the files in this side of the thing, I became quite interested in just like the plant specimens as I was going around and doing those. And I guess like leading on from becoming a photographer, I thought, oh, it would be nice to go on nature walks in these video games and, you know, just look at the plant life. And for me, like that kind of then gets more interesting when you look at how plants are represented in different games and different versions of reality and all these kind of things. But like what we're looking at here is actually the textures for one of the homeless people. So let me try and, so there are his shoes and socks. That's a hat, and that's a face. So that's what the like one of the non-playable character spaces looks like. It's basically, imagine you peeled off the skin off a human head and laid it out like Jeffrey Dahmer or something like that. But as you can see, like they definitely don't look as photographically real in this. They're actually all airbrush things. So in a way, like in question of like you know, of representation and you know who's creating these things, I think like maybe probably spelled this absolutely crap. So you know the work of Lynette Lydium Boekier. These sorry, Lynette Lydium Boekier. So these are all paintings of African people, but they're all done out of her head. Like they're not people who've ever existed, but they're painted in a way that's like so manipulative and full of kind of like they're full of kind of love and intrigue and kind of empathy. They're just incredibly amazing images. But like, you know, we're looking at these people and they all look like they reference photography in a way of how we remember people through images and this kind of stuff. And like, but in her work, like none of these people ever existed, and it's quite similar to like non-playable characters in video games as well. Like they're producing people that look like people do in reality, but they're not necessarily based on any specific person. They're just dressed in particular ways, and like different clothes are put on them in order for us, the viewer, to complete that kind of image of what they are. You know, we kind of bring our own prejudice to the table in that kind of sense.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I think that we should have one last question. I know there's more questions which are coming in, but I'm a bit worried about our artist because I know he needs to be in top shape to perform after this. So I think do you want to elaborate on why you chose cyanotypes among other possible printing mechanisms? Since we're talking about work, maybe that's a good follow-up question, and we can.
Well, what cyanotype does offer us is a few things. It's a photochemical process, therefore you have a material object at the end of it. It will produce a unique image because there's going to be lots of noise and photochemical disturbance on the surface of the page. It'll offer noise in terms of the, you know, what's happening in the sky above you when you're exposing them outdoors. If clouds go over the sun, it's going to affect your image. You know, they kind of become part of the kind of wider cosmos in that kind of way. But also like I guess like art historically, and then just trying to, you know, create this bridge, like to find some. I'm always trying to find different media. Like I don't feel like I'll ever resolve it entirely, but to find some medium that's going to bridge together, you know, the material and digital aspects of our lives, and to begin to kind of find these, like the producing a cyanotype image is kind of like this is like very performative act in itself. I feel like in terms of, you know, mixing chemicals and getting down on the ground in the dark and painting them on the surface of the image, and it becomes this other kind of, in a way, frees the image from being undead to being properly dead on the page, in a way, because this is a unique image. It cannot be reproduced in an identical way, in the same way that every time you load your video game, bar a couple of maybe changes in the wind, you're seeing the exact same models and JPEG textures wrapped around the images in there. So it kind of like brings a kind of, gives a materiality to kind of substance of the from the digital realm.
Okay, sorry, one very last question, because I just think it's a nice way to wrap it up in this specific time. I think Mark is asking, now that the world in lockdown looks more like the world as predicted by GTA, what are the implications for the world of GTA as a result of lockdown?
But the world of GTA is going to get like busier because like people are playing more video games. Now that doesn't mean like the aesthetic experience will be busier, but what it does mean is that there's going to be a lot more network activity, and we're going to be using a lot more bandwidth over the internet. It means there's going to be data centers that help run all of these online kind of networks of video games, churning out electricity all over the planet. And I think like it's definitely going to, like, all these games, as they get busier and busier, it's important to remember that like there's nothing really virtual about these things. They're digital processes that are happening on a computer, either on your console or your PC at home, or in a data center on the outskirts of a city somewhere. And like the consequences of this won't be visible in Grand Theft Auto because, there's a limit to the amount of online players that can be on at once. And so the aesthetic experience will change. But the increase of frequency of people, going online will have an actual ecological impact on the world. So if you can think about those pieces of garbage that were in the weeds in that model I was showing earlier on, like those pieces of virtual litter have a carbon footprint. Like they're stored on a computer, they're downloaded, they're loaded out of your RAM and your graphics processor, they're transferred to a screen. I was loading it there, I was sending it to 93 people in the Zoom conference. Like these virtual pieces of litter are burning up things. So I don't think we should, or I think we should stop thinking about this stuff in these kind of binary relationships and kind of begin to think about how these things are part of our world already. Like ontological examination of how these worlds are made up will reveal a very material connection to our own ecologies. And like it's kind of maybe it could be an important moment to kind of think about kind of either kind of consolidating those in your head or kind of beginning to change how you look at what's virtual in that way.
And on that note, I think that we can end here the session, and I'd like to thank you once again for this fantastic screen walk. We've been places, and we've seen files and textures and games, and again, like going through your process, I think has been quite inspirational for all of us. I'm thanking also, of course, all of you who joined here in Zoom and all the people out there on screen walks and on Twitch looking at the live stream. As we mentioned at the beginning, I think that now Alan will take a very short break, and then we
15 minutes, I'd say.
15 minutes, and then we can join the performance back on Twitch. For the others, I'd like to remind everyone that we're back in 2 weeks on 6th May.
Yeah, we'll have the third screen walk with Rob Kerms, who will be looking into virtual worlds and to how people relate and socializes on those virtual worlds. So we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks from now, same time, same day, Wednesday, and we will be doing our third screen walk with him. So please join us then. But now, again, as Marco just said, just like a few minutes to go, again, to have a glass of water, go to bathroom of these kind of things, and join us again on the screenwalls.com to watch Alan's live performance.